SoundCartel.
From SoundCartel, I'm Nicole Goodman, and this is Business Essentials Daily. With an unpredictable president now in the White House, the economic situation for 2025 is proving extremely difficult to forecast. So we've turned to Alan Kohler, renowned business and finance journalist and editor-in-chief of InvestSMART Group. While Alan says the Australian economy is in a good place right now, sluggish productivity gains and growing economic inequality may lead to the sort of political situation we see now in the States. And he's not as confident about impending rate cuts as the market seems to be. As he explains to Jeff Waters, the positive situation in early 2025 isn't being felt by everybody.
Well, it finds itself in reasonable shape. I mean, in particular, the labour market is very strong, unemployment 4%. In some ways, the labour market is a bit too strong for the rate cuts that people still want. And really, I think what's happened is that the economy has weathered the big increase in interest rates that the Reserve Bank has brought about really well. So, yeah, the Australian economy is in good shape.
Doesn't feel that way, though, for most of us, does it?
Well, that's the problem with aggregates. I mean, the ABS and the Reserve Bank use aggregate data and they look okay. But as you say, there's a widening of inequality, and so that there's a lot of people who are really doing it tough, particularly those with big mortgages because interest rates have gone up a lot. And so, yes, that's the problem we have in Australia at the moment, is that inequality has widened. The aggregate data looks okay, but a lot of people are doing it really hard.
We've got a new president in the White House and the federal elections coming very soon. Is it possible at all to forecast what's going to happen in the economy this year?
Well, of course. I mean, Donald Trump is very unpredictable. Who knows what he's going to do? He has promised to impose tariffs, both universal tariffs and big tariffs on China, Mexico and Canada, but the one that concerns us really is China. There's not a lot of expectation that he'll put tariffs on Australia, but if he puts big tariffs on China, that could affect Australia in a second-hand way. So, yeah, I mean, a lot depends on what happens with a trade war, if there is one, between America and China.
You mentioned before that employment being strong might actually be a problem insofar as rate cuts is concerned, because it's obviously something the Reserve Bank has to follow very closely. But a great majority of the recent new jobs have come from the public sector. So is the government kind of shooting itself in the foot there by employing too many people and affecting rate cuts?
Yeah, that's a good way to put it, in fact. I mean, the employment, as you say, is largely about government employment. I mean, the same can be said of GDP. Although GDP is reasonably strong, it's entirely about government investment and government consumption, and also the increase in population. And so the aggregate data on GDP, along with the aggregate data on employment, is presenting a slightly false picture of the economy in some ways. I mean, per capita GDP is negative and has been for 7 consecutive quarters. But yes, the employment data is largely about the government. A lot of it is state government infrastructure spending, building bridges, tunnels and so on. There's a lot of that going on. And, in some ways that's just what the governments have to do. That's just catching up, really, with the increasing population that's occurred.
And if there is no rate cut over the next couple of months or the next couple of opportunities to cut rates, if that doesn't happen, will the dollar continue to slide, and won't that help inflation?
Well, obviously, a lower dollar does tend to increase the prices of imports. So, yes, a lower dollar is inflationary. The dollar has fallen about 10% against the US dollar, largely, in fact, almost entirely, because of the stronger US dollar in anticipation of tariffs, which have not yet occurred. But anyway, the one that matters for inflation and the RBA and interest rates is the trade-weighted index, not the US dollar. And the trade-weighted index has only fallen 5% because other currencies have fallen as much, if not more, against the US dollar than ours. So the TWI down 5% is not that big a deal, really. It's kind of normal. So at this point, you'd have to say that the decline in the dollar is not going to be a big deal, is not inflationary and won't have any impact on the RBA. But if it keeps going, of course, then it starts to become an issue.
Given the global nature of economics, is there anything the Australian government can actually do to control the situation, or is it out of their hands?
Oh, no, it's not out of their hands. There's lots the Australian government can do. Firstly, in the short term, the amount of spending or tax cuts or tax increases the government undertakes has a big impact on the economy. We've already seen the energy rebates have had a big impact on inflation, although the Reserve Bank doesn't take much notice of that, but it still has had a decent impact, and it certainly has affected households. And as we've seen, the government spending and investment has had a huge impact on GDP. There's most of the GDP growth that we've seen, and employment, as you pointed out before. So, the government can have a big impact, but also the other problem that the Australian economy has is low productivity, which has been declining. And a lot of that has to do with the lack of reform that's been undertaken by government. In the past sort of 20 or 30 years, the best productivity period of the Australian government was the 80s and early 90s, when Hawke and Keating undertook so much reform in the economy, and that led to a much more productivity. So the decline in productivity in some ways is weighing on the economy and holding us back. So there's much that the government can do to improve that.
What sort of things would you recommend?
Oh, well, they've got to be careful, though. We've seen a huge increase in productivity in the United States, partly as a result of the looser labour market, but also a lot of increased investment in technology. So the government can encourage increased investment in technology. That's certainly something it could and should do. Looser labour markets, the trouble with that is it has a dark side. It tends to increase inequality, and what we've seen in the United States is that the population has become very angry about what's occurred. Even though productivity is very high, they've been moved to appoint a convicted felon as president because of that anger. And, there's a case for saying, and I recently wrote a column in the ABC about the fact that a lot of that can be put down to the things behind the improved productivity, I think. And so there's a flip side to the high productivity in the US, which is that a lot of people get left behind. So that you need to be careful about that.
That's an extremely interesting argument. And is there an argument for the Australian government taking control back of interest rates from the Reserve Bank?
Oh, definitely not. I think the independence of the Reserve Bank is a good thing for the economy, good thing for people. I think that the last thing we want is for those interest rate decisions to be political. I think that they need to be made on economic grounds. Yes, you can make an argument that, the Reserve Bank is relatively heartless, should have reduced interest rates to improve the lot of those who are suffering. But I don't think it would be a good idea to chuck the baby out with the bathwater and give it back to politicians.
All right. Well, it doesn't stop the politicians from criticising the decisions, that's for sure. So is it fair to say, do you think that 2025 economically is going to be a bit of an unpredictable mixed bag and an exciting, shall we say, ride?
Well, it's certainly true of the United States and Donald Trump, that's for sure. It's unpredictable, going to be exciting, a bit scary. Who knows what will happen? Anything could happen. The flurry of announcements already by Donald Trump shows that, anything could happen. As for Australia, it really comes down to interest rates and whether interest rates are cut. The futures market is putting 70% odds on a rate cut in February. So the market at least thinks there'll be a rate cut in February. If that happens, and there's more than one rate cut, then I think that the economy will improve and people's lives will improve. I'm not sure that'll happen. I certainly don't think there'll be a rate cut in February, but I guess there should be one later this year.
That's Alan Kohler, Editor-in-Chief of InvestSMART Group. This episode of Business Essentials Daily is produced by the team at SoundCartel. Thanks for listening. I'm Nicole Goodman. We'll bring you more Be Daily tomorrow. Follow @BE Daily Podcast across social media and head to bedaily.com.au for more from the Business Essentials Daily podcast. SoundCartel.